All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 17, Section 2, Homesteading, Dreams and Realities. So let's recall homesteaders, otherwise called sod busters. These are people who moved out west. And especially sod busters, these are farmers. That's what it refers to. Sod is another word for dirt. Again, a sod buster would be somebody who plows it. And it's, these people are named after the Homestead Act, which essentially gave land to farmers. So there's free land, essentially, gave land to farmers. Free land. And so this allure of free land in the West actually brought a lot of people out there. But what they found was, in some ways, they were advertised something that wasn't the reality. So that's why you have kind of this dream of free land, but then the reality that begins to set in. Most of these individuals, these sod busters, these homesteaders, are kind of in this region here. Maybe we'll include Wyoming a little bit, Kansas, Oklahoma to a certain degree, Wisconsin, right? They're kind of in that area. That's where they're looking to farm. And recall that for a very long time in American history, and maybe we can include some of this other territory out here as well, this was referred to as the Great American Desert. And that was because the belief was that it was just too arid of land to be farmed. But irrigation, which is essentially man-made waterways, made it possible. So even though there was quote-unquote free land by the Homestead Act, there were a lot of things that did come with the cost, and irrigation was specifically one of them. So this is, a necessity for farming. And even though the land itself was free, in order to get water there, right, it's going to cost money. And this is going to put farmers in a very difficult situation. This was somewhat alleviated by the Newlands Reclamation Act, which set aside funds for irrigation. I believe that wasn't passed till 1902. So, it helped a little bit in terms of getting irrigation projects going, but still is very difficult, very expensive. When homesteaders or sod busters moved out west, what they experienced was the very harsh reality. Living conditions were often tough. Many of them lived in sod houses. That is a mud house. You have a picture of a mud house here. So that would be very uncomfortable. That farmers were at the mercy of the weather, which could also include things like droughts, which could be potentially disastrous for farming, swarms of bugs, which could potentially eat their crops, rain, hail, snow, etc., etc. So this was a very, what we might call tough, and in some cases isolated living experience. Very much different than that dream, right, of free land that drew so many people out west to begin with. And like I mentioned before, the costs were, there were so many costs that were associated with farming out west. Irrigation was just one of them, but others included livestock, wells, fencing, seeds, fertilizer. This all cost money. And really, in order to be competitive, these were requirements. Were required, right? So, you couldn't simply just go out west and farm without these things, because you would be, there'd be other farmers that were using these types of latest and greatest technological advancements, whether that was things like fencing, irrigation, fertilizer, and they would be able to sell their products. They would grow better crops, and they would be able to sell them at a cheaper price, whereas you would simply just get swallowed up by the competition. So, you had essentially to do this. Not to mention the way that the railroad industry was exploiting farmers. And really what they did was they charged different prices, right? And this was a necessity. As a farmer, you had to use the railroads because when you grew your crops out west, in order to get those crops back to the market, to get them to somebody you could actually sell to, you had to put them on the railroads, and there were no other really transportation means around. And so if you're the railroad company, you could essentially charge farmers whatever you wanted, and that's essentially what they did. And so railroads became really kind of one of the focal points for anger by farmers, really against the big corporations. And they charged different prices at different times of the year. So when it was time for harvest, for example, when all the farmers were picking their crops and getting ready to sell them, that's when the railroad companies would jack up the prices. In order to pay for all of these things, right, to pay for the irrigation, to pay for the seeds, to pay for the railroads, farmers were forced to take out loans, and banks charged high interest rates. And you really had no choice. It was either you borrow this money, you get the technology that is needed in order to produce at a competitive level, or you simply just go out of business, and then the bank ends up, repossessing your land anyways. And so, banks and railroads, kind of as two giant corporate monopolies in some ways, really took advantage of a lot of these Western farmers. The effect that railroads and technology had was that crop prices dropped. Now, we typically think of low prices as a good thing, but for producers, you actually want high prices. And so this was, very disruptive for farmers, right? Think about it. If you're growing corn, you want the price of corn to be high, because the higher the prices, the more that you could sell it for. Well, because all these technological advances were breaking through, the prices dropped and farmers really really suffered. Bonanza farms, these are large scale farms, simply survived because they had the means necessary, whereas small scale farms didn't. We might think of these as, these are, I would have said maybe 10 years ago, these are the Walmart of farms, but this is really like the Amazon of farms. Whereas all of your smaller farms, your mom and pop farms, whatever, they're just getting crushed out by the competition. So bonanza farms succeeded more so than those individual people who moved out west. This was displayed, this farm life was illustrated in, if you've heard of Little House on the Prairie, which was a book and later on a TV show. Now, it was tough for both men and women, but there were specific challenges for women in the West. So just add up all of the things that everybody faced in the West, including, very uncomfortable life, but also add that the risk of childbirth, which was a very, maybe not high, but there certainly was a chance of death that could happen at childbirth, certainly complications, and especially out west where things were isolated, where there was really very little help within a small range. You got on top of that the limited rights that women had. This was not just true out west, but practically everywhere in the United States. So for example, women were not able to sell property, could not divorce, could not serve in juries, and of course could not vote, and also could not hold office. However, there were some women out west who had more responsibility than their eastern counterparts, and that was widows. Widows are wives whose husbands died. And typically when the husband died on one of these farm families, the widow then took responsibility for the farm. And, this burden, this type of responsibility that some of these widows had in the West on some of these farms was unlike anything that, women had in the eastern cities, for example.